Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. On this episode, we're bringing back to the fore the story of an airplane crash that didn't just end in tragedy, but also ripped the veil off the relations between Baku and Moscow. An aviation tragedy has become the latest episode in a relationship that rivals even the most convoluted on-again, off-again relationship you know. This crash, tragic as it truly was, has unearthed a cascade of systemic flaws that go far beyond human error. It's exposed the cracks in a delicate relationship between two mighty nations, where every misstep sends ripples of distrust across international borders. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Azerbaijan is trying several Armenian citizens over offences resulting from what Azerbaijani authorities have labelled as previous Armenian aggression. What's particularly different about this trial is that it concerns the transportation of arms from Russia to Armenia between 2001 and 2021. And these weren't small-sized weapons either. The transfers included Iskander-Ms, mobile short-range ballistic missile systems. Russia has been using these in its war against Ukraine, and they are nuclear-capable. A plethora of different missiles and rocket systems were also transported. Azerbaijani prosecution says that the weaponry was used against their country during various military clashes between the two sides. What's worth noting, however, is that the acquisition of such weapons would most likely be impossible without Russia's permission. And Moscow is, or at least used to be, a declared ally of both of these countries.
Russia will continue to contribute in every possible way to the normalization of Azerbaijani-Armenian cooperation.
Today, the Kremlin clearly prefers working with Azerbaijan. It didn't even move a finger when in 2023, Baku rolled into Nagorno-Karabakh. The resulting fallout between Armenia and Russia remains to this day. Yerevan has suspended its operations as part of the Moscow-led Collective Security Treaty Organization and has been turning to different partners.
When people talk about Europe, they mean freedom, they mean human rights, they mean top medical care, high-quality education.
The geopolitical shift from Armenia goes beyond mere words and platitudes. Very recently, the country took its first major step toward a serious EU membership bid, though this road will be a long one and Russia is not expected to simply let it happen.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. The relationship between Baku and Moscow have been shifting over decades, filled with alliances and rivalries. One minute they're partners because of mutual benefits, and the next they're stepping on each other's toes. And in the midst of this, a catastrophic airplane crash has thrown a wrench into the choreography, exposing how fragile that dance really is. And in the case of an Azerbaijani plane crash, it isn't just a case of two bureaucracies squabbling over who's to blame. It's a glaring demonstration of how systemic issues, poor communication, and a lack of accountability, being some of them, can turn a technical failure into a full-blown diplomatic crisis. Apologies, finger-pointing, promises of investigations all ensued. It's almost as if both sides were trying to perform a synchronized routine of deflection and denial while the real victims, passengers and their families, were forgotten about. The broader picture is that this crash has cast a long shadow over an already tenuous relationship. For years, whispers of dissent and mutual suspicion has been building beneath the surface. And now, they're boiling over into open criticism. It is a dramatic reminder that when national pride and political ambitions come into play, even the most advanced system can crumble like a poorly built sandcastle. However, the exposed flaw in Baku-Moscow relations could be the catalyst for overdue changes. Perhaps this will spur a genuine conversation about accountability, modernization, and, dare I say, common sense in managing both our technological and political infrastructure. And now, here to shed more light on the issue, we have Zoltan Zahidov from the Center of Analysis of International Relations and Rusif Husinov, Director of the Topchupashov Center. Hello, guys, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you for inviting.
Hello, thanks for having us.
So, Rusif, we are looking today at the situation, well, the relation between Russia and Azerbaijan after the so-called plane incident. Can you give us a little bit of a look at the before and after? How has the relation dynamic changed? And do you think that their recent relationship and their dynamic is defined by this particular incident?
Oh, yeah, thank you for the question. Indeed, Azerbaijan had its foreign policy based on what I call equidistance, or an equal distance from both Western and Russian/Eurasian blocs, which meant Azerbaijan never aspired for membership in either bloc. It gave the Azerbaijani leadership a lot of flexibility and room for maneuver. On the one hand, it conducted very independent foreign policy. On the other hand, it never tried to antagonize the regime in Kremlin by aligning itself with NATO-like military blocs in the West. However, this airplane incident has worsened the Azerbaijan-Russia relations. Despite its obvious involvement in the tragic incident, the Russian side still denies what Azerbaijan expects it to do so. And we have clear demands from Baku. It's an official apology, an admission of guilt, and accountability for those responsible. Also, compensation for the Azerbaijani state, the passengers, and the crew who suffered from the plane crash. Right now, the Russian side has not been responsive on these demands, and this is why the deterioration of the relations is still underway.
Right. Mr. Sultan, can you help us understand why the reluctance to take responsibility from the Russian side? Do you think that by doing that, there's something to lose from their part?
Well, actually, this is a good question, which is so far unanswered. I mean, all this happened after the plane crash of December 25th. And we know that Azerbaijan had certain just demands from Russia, such as conviction of those who are responsible, compensation for to the families of victims. But nevertheless, the Russia so far has been very unresponsive. And we have to add that certain Russian, let's say, pro-Kremlin media outlets, they kept continuing to obfuscate the role of Russia in this incident by releasing such fabricated news as if the plane was hit by a flock of birds and stuff like that. Therefore, Azerbaijan is definitely waiting for the fair explanation, accountability, and to make sure that the relationship will go smooth because of the Russian acknowledgement of the accountability, and when Russia, of course, pays compensation for the to the families of victims.
Right. So, Mr. Sultan, can you help us also understand where do you think the Kremlin is taking this? We do know that Russia is always trying to gain influence over whichever area it can get its hands on. Why make this such a hot-button issue? And do you think that maybe the Kremlin would stand to lose from this relation, or is there a possibility that they might be looking elsewhere?
Well, I don't know. There can be certain factors impacting the I would say, I wouldn't say hesitance, but this non-responsiveness of the Kremlin. One of the factors could very well be that they have been engaged in the war with Ukraine for all of these 3 years. And as a factor is that they are waiting for certain conditions to arise. And certainly it can also be possible that they just neglect it because they don't give much emphasis on that right now. But I do believe that Russia, let's say, praises its relationship with Azerbaijan, as Azerbaijan is geostrategically very important for Russia, and especially taking into consideration the fact that now Russia and Iran signed a new gas deal, which, let's say, envisaged the transfer of Russian gas to Iran via Azerbaijan. Mm-hmm. So taking into consideration all these aspects, I would say Russia should be worried and concerned about with respect to relationship with Azerbaijan, and should try to fend, let's say, to mend the fences with Azerbaijan.
All right, Rusif, like Mr. Sultan mentioned here, if the fences aren't mended, do you see a world where Russia actually becomes closer with Armenia in this instance?
How the relations between Baku and Moscow will develop will be up to the Russian side. On the one hand, it seems uneasy for the Kremlin regime, who's built on the tough image of the Siloviki faction, to eat humble pie and accept a known blunder. On the other side, Russia, especially due to the war in Ukraine, has no luxury of affording another hostile or antagonistic country in the very close neighborhood. Azerbaijan has not developed economic independence, unlike the neighboring Armenia, for instance, from Russia, which also provides us with a lot of political independence and bigger room for maneuver. As many experts here in Azerbaijan believes, Russia currently needs Azerbaijan more than the latter needs the former. So it will be up to the decision makers in Moscow to somehow mend this relationship.
Right, and it does seem quite difficult given the current situation. It does seem, like you mentioned, that Russia is very reluctant to make any amends when it comes to this particular situation, with a lot of deflections, denial. Do you think there's actually a playbook here, Rusif?
Unfortunately, the Azerbaijani Airlines flight 8243 became included in the famous list of civilian aircraft downed by the Russians. You can remember the two Korean airliners which were shot down during the Cold War era. And then there is this notable incident with Malaysian Airlines MH17. None of these incidents was ever followed by any admission of guilt whatsoever. The Russians will probably try to continue this pattern, because otherwise they could have established a precedent, which means the Russians usually accept guilt and apologize. So they don't want to create this kind of a precedent. At the same time, they need to somehow find a common language with the Azerbaijani side, which has picked up a very, very harsh and bellicose rhetoric against the Russians in the recent weeks.
Right. Mr. Sultan, can you help us also understand how has it been historically between Azerbaijan and Russia? How have their relation evolved throughout the past decade?
Looking at the not remote past, we can say that after the establishment of independence, there were, let's say, there have been high level of cooperation between Russia and Azerbaijan in various fields, including trade, economy, taking into consideration the fact that approximately 2 million people living in Russia, which also definitely plays a role in the strengthening of relationship between two states. In 2000s, after Vladimir Putin came to power, let's say there were certain problems, especially with respect to the Nabucco pipeline, which was on the agenda back in mid-2000s. But nevertheless, since that time, especially after the recent past, the relationship has been developing tremendously. Especially, we have to take into consideration that in February 2022, Azerbaijan and Russia signed an agreement, alliance agreement, and therefore we can't say that there were certain problems between Russia and Azerbaijan until the very recent incident with respect to the plane crash that happened on December 25th, 2024.
All right, so two countries does seem quite close before the incident, Mr. Sultan. Do you think that at some point, because of their mutual interest, this dialogue and this cooperation kind of relationship will be reignited? Or do you think that this incident is going to be too big of a rift to overcome if Russia decided to just never take accountability?
Well, I do hope that this escalation will not go further, because there is always room for a dialogue, as Azerbaijan also puts it forward. And based on the recent press release issued by the press secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Maria Zakharovna, they also hope that the relationship will be mended in the near time future. She spoke about the historical economic ties between our states. So definitely there is room for dialogue, and hopefully there will be certain developments in the relationship, of course, after Russia admits its guilt, first of all, and let's say organizes the objective commission of those who were responsible for their plane crash.
Right. Mr. Rusif, like Mr. Solan just mentioned here, yeah, please.
This standoff between Azerbaijan and Russia can continue, or the leadership in both countries can find some room for dialogue and try to, improve the worsening relations. Either of these scenarios may happen, and it may not actually matter too much in this very context, in my opinion, whether the Russian side finally assumes the responsibility, makes an official and unambiguous apology, and agrees to pay compensation or not. Because Azerbaijan, again, in my humble opinion, has already won this case by publicizing this whole incident, making a lot of noise, not pulling back and standing its ground vis-a-vis a big and, so speaking, not so polite neighbor.
So, of course, we'll have to see whether the bridge is completely burned. But in the meantime, thank you guys so much for your input and insight, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says that his country fully supports Ukraine's complete territorial integrity. The Turkish leader also declared that his country would be an ideal host for peace talks.
As the idea of fully realized peace negotiations for the war in Ukraine is taking shape, Turkey does not want to be left by the roadside. During a meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky in Ankara, Erdogan informed him of his country's willingness to host future negotiations. He reminded him of Turkey's role in previous mediation efforts, as well as its pivotal part in securing the Black Sea grain deal. The agreement had let Ukraine export agricultural products until Russia withdrew from it in 2023. The meeting between the two presidents comes as senior US and Russian teams met in Saudi Arabia for direct discussions concerning the conflict. US President Donald Trump has said that he plans to meet with Vladimir Putin, quote, very soon, but did not offer a specific date.
Kazakh oil exports are expected to drop in the wake of a Ukrainian drone strike on the southern Russian oil pipeline. Export volumes are forecasted to drop by almost a third over the next 2 months.
Drones carrying explosives reportedly hit a pumping station belonging to the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. The station carries Kazakh oil across South Russia, which is later exported through the Black Sea to various countries, including Western Europe. Russia's state pipeline operator says that the damage from the attack will take between 1.5 to 2 months to fix. Therefore, it expects a 30% drop in the volume of Kazakh oil that is being pumped through the pipeline. The pipeline itself is owned by a multinational consortium in which the Russian and Kazakh governments also are stakeholders. Other stakeholders include several Western energy giants, such as Shell. It carried approximately 80% of Kazakhstan's crude oil exports and around 1% of the world's oil supply.
The findings of a European Union study on gender equality warns that child marriage continued to be an issue among Central Asian countries. Even though the practice is outlawed in many of them, the crimes are often not prosecuted.
About 1 in every 5 marriages in Kyrgyzstan involve so-called bride kidnapping, according to the study's preliminary findings. This practice is particularly common in the rural parts of Kyrgyzstan, and those who commit it are rarely prosecuted. This is because a large part of the country's society views it as a cultural tradition and not a crime. This problem doesn't just concern Kyrgyzstan, however. Another report published by the human rights organization Equality Now warns that forced marriage cases also occur in other Central Asian countries, Russia's North Caucasus regions, and in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. These countries are also struggling with the issue of child marriage, where girls under the age of 18 are often coerced into unions. All of the countries covered in the report have an official minimum marriage age of 18, but there are many loopholes in this law. A lack of political will combined with religious, cultural and social attitudes are described as major obstacles to overcoming these problems.
Russia's war against Ukraine has fueled a boom among Russians obtaining Kyrgyz passports. Now over 7,000 Russian citizens acquired Kyrgyz passport in 2024.
For years, wealthy Russians have turned to so-called golden passports for less restrictive travel and financial security. They would also turn to external visa programs in havens such as Cyprus or Malta. But the sanctions and restrictions which came down on Russia in the wake of its invasion of Ukraine complicate matters. Thus, some citizens turn to a different market for secondary passports, Kyrgyzstan. Some Kyrgyz opposition lawmakers aren't too happy about the situation. There has been a massive spike in Russians obtaining Kyrgyz passports since 2022. While these numbers remain small compared to the country's entire population, they have spawned an online market which helps Russians obtain passports, leading to concerns over fraud and corruption. What's more, observers note that the country's optics, should this trend continue, will plummet.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.